Let's jump into this. For those who have been with us, this is, I want to welcome you back to the America's Christian Heritage Tour. I'm talking about the tour that 56 of us will be taking in June. We actually have tour guides. Actually, there's about 3 of us. So they told me, they go, feel free to chime in. I'm not going to chime in whenever. I go, we'll be at every location all day long, So, but I'll come at select points. We're going from Boston to Washington, D.C. in 8 days. And whether you're going to be with us or not, there's a lot of people that are listening to this online, giving a lot of background information. Because for a lot of historic spots, you just walk right up to it and people are like, so what's the old Congregational Church? When was it founded? What was going on in America at the time? It is so critical to understand America's Christian heritage. You can't understand America's heritage without understanding its Christian heritage. So, we talked about the Pilgrims. We talked about them coming in. We talked about the difference of the Puritans, the Separatists. We talked about the Great Migration and what filled up the northeastern corner. We talked about some of the Indian struggles and warfare with the people at the time. Some of the internal workings. And up in Boston, there was more happening up there. So I'm going to lead, where we're going to go to this time is this. I'm going to talk about some of the background to what was going on leading up to the Revolution, including the Great Awakening. Everybody ever heard of the Great Awakening? And the 7 Years' War, which was actually more like 9 years. But these are all things that preceded the Revolution. Everything that kind of set the foundation for it. So here's the first thing I want to tell you. Let me grab and make sure I got my papers right. There was a revolution happening at the time. National, political, religious, philosophical, and scientific. The whole Western Hemisphere was changing. Migration was happening, rebellion was happening, new ways of thinking about the life and planet Earth were happening. And so last time I talked about some of the religious churnings that were happening. But now I want to jump to, where do I want to jump to, Stephen? The revolution in human reasoning. This is all happening, remember this, 1600s up to 1750. Just so you go from 1608, Jamestown settled, 1620, the Pilgrims settled, the Great Migration, 1620 and 40. They had war back with England, little incipient wars going on. And at the same time as all this is happening in the late 1600s, the Salem witch trial, in the early 1700s, some new ways of thinking from the late 1600s in this. You remember I talked about Isaac Newton a couple times back. I'm going to go through these fast because I want to set it up for another crash course video. And then, so I just love this guy. Actually, Jared LeGroux is here. Dr. Jared LeGroux teaches as a professor back in Pennsylvania. And he says, it was good to see you using Crash Course. Teachers everywhere use this Crash Course guy because he does, or his company, does such a great job to summarize history. So I'm going to do that, and then there's a 5-minute video at the end. That's about a 9-minute video. 5-minute video at the end that is going to walk you through the Freedom Trail where we're actually going. But it will make no sense to go to Boston to hit the Freedom Trail if you're walking down the road going, what's that? Why are we here? All of these things I've talked about filled up this area. So there's a revolution going on, socially, religiously, scientifically. In the minds of many people, the time seemed right for a faith centered in a universal reason. 1687, there's that date. Isaac Newton used calculus to show how gravity could explain the mystery of planetary movements. He never intended to move away from God. He saw him like Copernicus, Galileo, as examining God's universe. But they went with these natural laws. Newton published his proofs in a book titled Mathematical Principles for Natural Philosophy. In the words of one poet, nature and nature's laws lay hidden in night. God said, let Newton be, and all was light. Next one there. Inspired by new possibilities of scientific reasoning, later thinkers developed new perspectives on how to seek and discover truth. The result? The Enlightenment, which focused on individual reasoning, words, science, and natural order. What? Oh, the endarkenment. That's right. It's just a different perspective. Next one. Individual reason was advocated in Western philosophy and cultural life as a primary source and legitimacy for authority. Here's a quote from Brian Hobbes. With human reason and the five senses crowned as king, mystery, including twin mystery of tradition and authority, which Eastern or Europe life had been based upon, is banished. A God, little g, who intervenes in human history as viewed as irrelevant. Next one. Many Enlightenment thinkers embrace deism. Deism is the great watchmaker. So in other words, God created the watch and then let it go. And some people, now this is a whole other debate. I'll get into it when we get down in Philadelphia, because many people say George Washington, Benjamin Franklin especially, were deists. They believed in God, and Thomas Jefferson, but did not believe in a God who intervened. That is not true. It's taught in the universities all the time, but it is not true. But nevertheless, deism did affect a lot of people's thinking, because you study the universe, the laws, and all of a sudden, next thing you think, God created it, and then it went. Where we've gone in modern times is to look back at these guys' life and to see all the natural stuff that came from this. So we hear natural law as if they are talking outside of a creator, and most of the time, that wasn't their point. That's our point today. So deism searched for a universal foundation in which all religions could agree. Most deists believed that a divine being had created the universe and natural laws, but this being was revealed to humanity primarily through the created order. Next. They saw value in Jesus and in his teachings, but only as the supreme expressions of someone who lived and taught according to the laws that God had embedded in the natural order. For those of you who will be with us down in Washington, D.C., we'll see the Bible Museum that just opened up in November. You will see Thomas Jefferson's Bible. Thomas Jefferson went through, because he was a part of this thinking, and his Bible takes out every miraculous moment of Jesus' life. And so what became important to these guys, I know you're going like, what? Because that intervention, what they wanted to try to get at is the real Jesus behind the Jesus. And that was part of their goal. That all came from this. Such deists, to be Christian was simply to live according to Christ's ethics. Wasn't that they didn't believe in him. They believed in him, but they saw his moral teachings as the things that were preeminent, not miracles. Even in this time of spiritual darkness, there you are, Stephen, God's people were praying in the early 1700s. These prayers resulted in a great awakening. Now picture this. So you're watching this revolution go on politically. You're having all these problems with the king back there. You start to have a problem with taxes and who makes the call, and even the local people. The tradition of the church is a problem, right? The High Anglican Church, you had separatists and Puritans in New England that were trying to make an awakening. And then all of a sudden, you have this revolutionary of science that sounds like really pagan stuff. And so the church had an awakening, became, I think in this course of that we're going to see in the 10-minute synopsis, he says they went from being really religious to super religious. So getting back really to the roots of the book of Acts, that was part of the Great Awakening thing. Couple more frames and then I'll let you see that history. Beginning in the 1720s, Nicholas von Zinzendorf and the Moravian pietists held prayer meetings in Herrnhut in Germany. In literal obedience to 1 Thessalonians 5:17, which says pray without ceasing, and Leviticus 6:13, which says what? I don't know either. Anyway, somebody look that up. Stephen will look it up. Prayers continued around the clock. It's just not Rolodexing at the moment. Too many verses in my brain. Next one, Stephen. I know you're looking it up, but next slide, please. Or not next slide. So get this time frame. Remember this. 1608 up to the 1750s. He's going to throw it up there. All right. Fire shall be kept burning continually on the altar. It's not to go out. So that's good. So They're praying. It's pray without ceasing. They're doing this. Thank you, Stephen. In 1734, more than 300 church members trusted Jesus Christ for the first time in the Northampton Awakening. Jonathan Edwards was the pastor of the Northampton Congregational Church. Okay, we're up around the Boston area. He preached sinners in the hands of an angry God. For them, it wasn't the Calvinist predestination that everyone's called and destined to life and not. You have a lot of choice in this. You have a choice. And that choice, based on a guy named Arminius, became elevated during this time. So Jonathan Edwards, another of these guys, Whitefield will come to him, will be preaching it. Next one. I'm giving you a lot because you got to see this because we got to get through Boston to get to New York next time. In 1736, an Anglican priest, now these mean something to you, named John Wesley. Did you know John Wesley was an Anglican priest? Now it makes sense back in England. Was impressed by a group of Moravian pietists on a ship. Quote, I went to America to convert the Indians. John wept after seeing their faith. Then he says, quote, but oh, who shall convert me? So he's sitting there, I know you're hearing this, as an Anglican priest going, man, everything we've done is wrong. Kind of picture Catholic priest. And he's like, but who's going to save me? John Wesley said, these are words to those wanting to rebel against the British. I have no representation in Parliament. I am taxed, yet I am no slave. Who then is a slave? See the Negro fainting under the load. You and I and the English in general go where we will and enjoy the fruit of our labors. This is liberty. The Negro does not. This is slavery. See, so what you have happening here are two things. A religious revival, but there's political just stirrings. And what happened was that the preachers started to get involved in both. Ever heard of the Black Robe Regiment? They'll come up down the road. A couple more. I'm going to give one more minute. 2 years later, John and his brother Charles were converted. Their methodological approach to discipleship in their holy clubs earned them the title of the Methodist. That's where the Methodists come from. They don't bear much of that life anymore in that respect. Next one. George Whitefield became the most famous Methodist preacher at the time. I think he came over to America 1739 to 41. His crusades, think Billy Graham. That's what they were doing. Thousands of people in the American colonies responded to his pleas for them to trust Christ Jesus. All of this was a part of the Great Awakening. Next. Oh, that is? Oh, sorry. When Jonathan Edwards heard Whitefield, he wept for joy. So picture this. Jonathan hears this. The response to Whitefield's messages was so amazing that people dubbed it the Great Awakening. Thank you, sir. But as pastors began focusing on the revolution against the British, the revival fires of the Great Awakening began to fade. So picture this. They're caught up in this. People are coming to Christ and doing this. At the same time, you're looking back on, man, this whole issue with this king, this is starting to chap my hide now. You've got decades of rebelling against this guy. So you had pastors in their pulpit who started preaching both. Revolutionary thought, this is what we get to call them, the Black Robe Regiment. They were at the heart of the revolution. So others, including John Wesley, opposed it. Many pastors favored it, declaring it the cause of America is the cause of Christ. In the end, the United States won independence from Britain. Is that it? In the third article of the New Nations Bill of Rights, remember Roger Williams? He started in Providence. Williams are founded in Providence, down in Rhode Island. His vision of religious freedom found its fulfillment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So, I want you to feel the revolutionary thought when we're going up to Boston, the Great Awakening and all of that. And it was happening not just in that northeastern corner, but everywhere around there. And there was the French Indian Wars that were happening in the mid 1700s that all led to this. So I want you to watch this little crash course on history. Love this guy. And then I'll give the last 5 minutes to that tour of the Freedom Trail, because then all those places will make sense. And I'll say something about it right after this. Watch this.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to discuss the events that led to the American Revolution. So we'll begin with the 7 Years' War, which, as Crash Course World History fans will remember, Winston Churchill referred to as the First World War. The Americans called it the French and Indian War. The Prussians called it the Third Silesian War. Swedes called it the Pomeranian War. For today, we're just going to call it the 7 Years' War on account of how it lasted for 9 years.
I just love this guy.
So here at Crash Course, we take a broad view of history, and rather than talking about the minute details of wars, we try to focus on the important stuff. Causes, effects, anytime Vladimir Putin might show up, and teacup kittens. And as far as causes go, the 7 Years' War was really, like most wars, about economics. Mr. Green, is this economics class? Because I don't remember signing up for it. Yeah, this is economics class, me from the past. It's economics and religion and psychology and anthropology and astronomy and physics and ecology and literature. That's the great thing about history. You can't put the past into little boxes that you study for 50 minutes a day until the bell rings. You can't separate what happened from what people wanted and believed and valued. Right, so mercantilism was the key economic theory of the British Empire in the 18th century. Because while Adam Smith and David Ricardo were talking up free trade and economic liberalism by 1750, no one was really listening. Mercantilism was basically the idea that the government should regulate the economy in order to increase national power. This meant encouraging local production through tariffs and monopolies, and also trying to ensure a favorable balance of trade. And colonies were an awesome way to create this favorable trade balance because they both produced raw materials and bought back finished goods made from those raw materials. But for it to work, you always need more and more land, so you can have more raw materials and more colonists to buy finished goods. By the way, it's important to understand the centrality of slavery in this colonial economy. I mean, the most important colonial trade goods were tobacco and sugar, and both of those crops relied heavily on slave labor. And slaves themselves were a key trade good in the so-called triangular trade between Europe, Africa, and the colonies. As one historian put it, the growth and prosperity of the emerging society of free colonial British America were achieved as a result of slave labor. So Britain's greatest rival in the 18th century was France. Like, on paper, the Spanish had a more significant empire in North America, and they'd certainly been there longer, but their empire was really sparsely populated. In fact, by 1800, Los Angeles, the most populous town in Spanish California, had a population of 300 and only 17 freeways. The French colonies were considerably more populous, but even so, by 1750, there were only about 65,000 French colonists, most of them in the St. Lawrence River Valley, thereabouts. I don't know, maybe it was somewhere over here. This isn't a terribly detailed map, and also I'm not looking at it. But the French were moving into the Mississippi and Ohio River valleys and forming alliances with American Indians there to try to dominate the fur and deerskin trades, and that proved problematic. So wars usually have really complicated causes, and it's very rare that we can refer to one thing as making them inevitable. Fortunately, the 7 Years' War is the exception to that rule. Dan, I think I just used the word exception, which means it's time for a mongeltage. I guess they heard there was an exception in town. So in 1749, the governor of Virginia awarded a huge land grant to something called the Ohio Company, which was basically a real estate development firm designed to benefit the governor of Virginia's friends. The Native Americans and their French supporters thought this was bad form because they thought they had rights to the land. So the Ohio Company asked the French to recognize their land claims, and the French were like, no! Let's go to the thought bubble. The actual fighting began when the British, or more precisely British colonists, led by a 21-year-old militia colonel named George Washington, yes, that George Washington, tried to eject the French from the forts they were constructing in western Pennsylvania. The first attempt in 1754 was a disaster. Washington built and then abandoned the ironically named Fort Necessity with the loss of 1/3 of his men. It was followed by the equally unsuccessful attack on Fort Duquesne, now located in downtown Pittsburgh, where the French and Indians pounded the British, killing 2/3 of General Braddock's forces and also General Braddock. Things didn't go much better for the British for the next 2 years, although they did take control of part of Nova Scotia and kick out more than 11,000 French Acadians, many of whom died in what is called the Expulsion. Some of those who didn't ended up in Louisiana and became Cajuns. But anyway, the tide began to turn for the British in 1759 when they captured French forts Duquesne, finally, Ticonderoga, and Louisburg. The biggest victory of all came in September when the British trounced the French at the Plains of Abraham near Quebec. Montreal surrendered the next year. The rest of the battles aren't that important unless you were fighting in them, and I'm sure you can count on the French and Indian War aficionados to fill the gaps in comments, but suffice it to say that the British were victorious in North America, the Caribbean, Europe, and as far away as India. The war continued officially for 3 more years and ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1763. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So the most obvious result of the war was terrible. territorial changes, particularly in the green areas of not America. And even though Britain won the war, they arguably got the short end of the territorial stick. Under the terms of the Peace of Paris, Britain got Canada from France and Florida from Spain. In return, France got Guadeloupe and Martinique, Caribbean sugar islands that were much more valuable, at least monetarily, than Canada. Sorry, Canada, but if you want to be valuable, grow some sugar. And not sugar beets either, Canada. Real sugar. And Spain got Cuba with its awesome sugar trade, and the Philippines with its proximity to China, which were much more valuable than Florida. I mean, at the time, Florida did not even have Disney World. Instead, it had yellow fever. But the real losers of the war were not the British or the Spanish or the French, but the Native Americans. The shuffling of territories meant the French were out of the Mississippi and Ohio River valleys, and the American Indians were stuck with the British, who kind of sucked. And as the British moved west, Native Americans felt compelled to fight back. Oh, it's time for the mystery document? The rules here are simple. If I'm wrong about the author of the mystery document, I will be shocked by electricity. If I am right, I will be shocked by my knowledge of 18th century primary sources. Okay, here we go. We humbly conceive that it is contrary to the maxims of good policy and extremely dangerous to our frontiers to suffer any Indians of what tribe soever to live within the inhabited parts of this province while we are engaged in an Indian war, as experience has taught us that they are all perfidious, and their claim to freedom and independence puts it in their power to act as spies, to entertain and give intelligence to our enemies, and to furnish them with provisions and warlike stores. To this fatal intercourse between our pretended friends and open enemies, we must ascribe the greatest of the ravages and murders that have been committed in the course of this and the last Indian War. We therefore pray that this grievance be taken under consideration and remedied. Enough. Usually you either know it or you don't. And I don't. The author is clearly not an Indian. The first person plural makes me think the author is probably not an individual, which makes it harder. Certainly we're getting a taste of the tension between colonists and Native Americans on the frontier. But who is writing about this tension? I have absolutely no idea. Stan, you get to shock me. Who is it? Are you serious? I told you it has to be an individual person! Fine. Ah! So after the end of the 7 Years' War, American Indians organized an armed revolt. In 1763, Indians, particularly from the Ottawa and Delaware tribes, launched what has come to be known as Pontiac's Rebellion. Now, of course, the rebellion ultimately failed to dislodge the British, but the Native Americans did manage to besiege Detroit and kill hundreds of settlers. And that convinced the British that if they wanted to avoid future conflicts, they should slow down the colonist settlements into the territories. So the British Parliament issued the Proclamation Line of 1763, which forbids settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains and reserved that territory for Indians. Now that sounds like a sensible policy until you remember that the British colonists had just finished fighting a war in order to get the right to move into that very territory. So the settlers duly ignored the Proclamation Line and got down to settling. The other big outcome of the 7 Years' War was that it set up the American Revolution. I mean, you've just seen colonists ignoring the British Parliament. We'll talk more about that next week, but around the end of the 7 Years' War, new ideas like republicanism were taking root in the colonies. Republicanism initially meant supporting a government without a king, but in the colonies it came to mean something broader. Now, they didn't believe that everyone was equal. Republicans believed that only property-owning citizens possessed virtue, which was defined in the 18th century not as being like morally good, but as a willingness to subordinate one's personal interest to the public good. This type of republicanism harkened back to a Roman ideal, only, without Caesar stabbing and togas. Stan, I wish you wouldn't. And a second type of political philosophy grew out of ideas that in the 18th century were called liberalism. For classical liberals, the main task of government was to protect citizens' natural rights, which were defined by John Locke as life, liberty, and property. For liberals like Locke, governments were the result of a social contract whereby individuals would give up some of their liberty in exchange for a government protecting their natural rights. So republicanism and liberalism were undermining traditional political authority, and so was the Great Awakening, in which Americans awakened from being very religious to being super religious. The Great Awakening took place in the early decades of the 18th century, and it was a revitalization of religious feeling, energized by revival meetings and the introduction of new denominations. In the early part of the 17th century, most of the English colonists were Anglicans, unless you count the Catholics running Maryland. But by the time of the Great Awakening, there were also Presbyterians and Baptists and Methodists, so my! Even the old-line Congregationalist churches were challenged by so-called New Light ministers who placed less of an emphasis on predestination and more on an individual's experience of salvation or being born again. So religion became much more emotional in the colonies, especially after the arrival of the Englishman George Whitefield, who went on a preaching tour from 1739 to 1741. The main thrust of his sermons was that humans need only repent to avoid the horrors of damnation and be saved. And he believed that salvation was within each individual. It's worth noting that this rise in religious fervor was not confined to America or even to Christianity. Like, for instance, Wahhabism, the Islamic reform movement that's still very closely associated with Saudi Arabia, began in the Middle East around the same time. So one of the keys in the American Revolution was a breakdown in respect for authority. And this was fueled partly by economics, partly by political philosophies that undermined faith and governance from afar, and partly by religious revivals that criticized not only church hierarchies, but also other aspects of colonial society. I mean, if people were going so far as to criticize their religious leaders and established religious norms, is it any wonder that they would criticize the acts of a parliament working an ocean away? We'll find out next week. Thanks for watching.
It's actually very good. So here's what I want you to do. You're getting the big picture for the places that we will tour in June. And in doing this, I want you to go back through, because these are all recorded with all the multimedia like our messages and posted online. And you can go through and listen again and slow it down. So I want to end here, and we can make this, Stephen. Yeah. And I go, the last 5 minutes, you'll just watch. It's in quiet. But this is, having said all of that over the last 2 sessions, this is the heart of Boston, and this is what's called the Freedom Trail, marked out by red bricks and red paint and red lots of things. And they hit roughly 16 official locations, there's about 50 unofficial, but that go along this trail. This is what our tour group will do. And what you will see are key places that happened that were part of the life of Boston, particularly through the Great Awakening and up through the Revolution. You're going to see things like, and listen, I could spend a whole session in each one of these. Don't give up on me. Boston Common, Massachusetts State House, we'll see Park Street Church, Granary Burial Ground, King's Chapel Burying Ground, King's Chapel, the Old Corner Bookstore, yeah, even that had the Old State House, the Boston Massacre Site. All of these are foundational things that we'll see. Now, before he starts the countdown, he's going to give you this. It's the last 4 minutes. You're just going to see in summary, because I got to go down to New York City next time we meet, which isn't on Easter. No class on Easter. But the Sunday after, I'm going down to New York, Ground Zero, Statue of Liberty, talk about America's Christian history here. But these are snapshots of the 16 key places that we'll get through, in an hour and a half when we're in Boston. Just kidding. We'll be there all day. Watch this, and then go to the countdown. Oh, see, I made it. I feel like that guy on the tape.
Well, nice to meet you.
Watch the dates and the people. Dates and people, and get the big picture. If you've come in and you are watching the 16 locations of the Boston Freedom Trail that 56 of us will see. So this is actually where we start our tour, and you're just seeing key locations that we will know. After this finishes, we'll go straight to the countdown for the service, but just for those of you in here, my American Christian Heritage course, which deals with the foundation of all these places, will not meet on Easter, but the one afterwards. But we're done in Boston. That's as much time as I can spend in it. I encourage you to go through this tape slowly and do some study on each of these locations, because they really are key. And I could spend from now till June going over each of these locations. But I got to kind of hit them in a big picture. I'm off to New York in 2 weeks. Watch this again online. It's all there for your choosing. Thank you.
Yeah, and then look at yours.
Thanks, Stephen, too.